Welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to talk a bit about this new joystick I got from Tesseract, which is the STONK. Unusual name, but it's actually a very powerful module. And only 16 HP, you get 2 channels of CV, but it's not just XY CV like you'd get on a normal joystick. You also get LFOs, Euclidean envelope generators. It's got a VCA built into it, and it's got audio processing. So it's got a multi-mode filter, reverb, and a wavefolder. It's pretty deep, as you would expect from a joystick. So, you'll need to give a little bit of clearance on the bottom because the joystick unit itself is quite big. It's not spring-loaded, but it does stay where you leave it, which I actually prefer myself personally. All right, let's get this set up in a case and get patching. And I'm going to show you how I tend to use it as a controller for my larger setup, which is over the other side there. Let's get stuck in. Okay, let's do a quick walkthrough of the user interface of STONK, and then we're going to set it up with some patches to explore how it works. As with all of the Tesseract modules, it's fairly clearly labeled inputs versus outputs. So the outputs are this row here surrounded by the colored golden block, and the inputs are up here. We have 2 channels corresponding to the CV outputs, which can be mapped to a variety of things, not just the XY position you'd normally find on a joystick. And in addition to 2 channels of CV processing, we also have 2 channels of audio processing. And this is where STONK is pretty unique, I think, because as a joystick, we can do both CV processing and recording and looping. We can also do audio processing and looping with it, and we'll explore that in a patch. The looping can be clock synced using this clock input here, and we can also record loops of audio and CV by either pressing this record button or by sending a gate trigger into this record input. Not only do we get the 2 outputs for the CV, we also get their sum and difference, so you actually have 4 CV sources here, which can be routed into different parts of a patch. Okay, I'm going to patch in the 2 channels, the yellow channel 1 and the pink channel, which you also see on the scope there. As I just plug it in, you're getting a little bit of scope noise. As you would normally expect with a joystick, XY is sort of the output here. And this is what I'm getting as you see on the scope. As I move the joystick around, we can do the classic XY outputs. But how do I change what's mapped to what? This is one of the beautiful things with STONK. You can just change the output mapping, for example, by pressing the channel you want to change, and then use this bottom row of buttons here to change the mode of that output. So right now the horizontal line is flashing, which means this is going to give out the XY output out of output 1. Say I swapped it and made output 1 be the vertical output. Now they're both the same, and as you see on the oscilloscope trace, the outputs are the same on both channels. There are a few other modes these outputs can be in. For example, it can also be an LFO. So here, channel 1 now is an LFO, and you see channel 2 is still the Y dimension on the axis, and the X controls the frequency of channel 1, the yellow there, and you see on the trace, and the Y controls the wave shape of channel 1. So now I have both an LFO and a manual control. I can set it to envelopes, and now channel 1 generates envelopes on the Euclidean pattern. The X controls the frequency of the envelopes being triggered, and the Y is the decay time. And these can all be changed, by the way. I'll show you that a little bit later. We can also use these to record and output the CV inputs here, and I'll get to that later on as well in the patch. But for now, let's set channel 1 back to just the X, and we leave channel 2 on Y, and we're going to get a patch set up to illustrate some audio output here using Warp. So I'm going to get this patched in, and then we'll take a look at what I've done. Okay, I've got a basic patch set up here using Warp. Now, the reason I chose Warp from Neuzeit instruments is it's got a lot of CV inputs, and we can change the sound up very dramatically by playing around with the modulation knobs. Let's just take a listen here. I'm going to patch the output of the oscilloscope for channel 1, say, into the modulation amount, and I'm going to patch spec, which is the spectral filter, into channel 2 on the oscilloscope, the pink channel, and those will correspond to the X and Y axes here on the joystick. Okay, now let's record the joystick movement so we can see what it's like to play back joystick movement. So if I move it, I want to be able to record that, so maybe I can go off and do something else in the patch. So we just press the record button here to arm it. It lights up. I'll hit play and start moving the joystick, and I'll press record again to stop recording. Now, as you see on the display on the oscilloscope, I'll just turn down the audio here, I only recorded the X direction. And why is that? Because I only had channel 1 selected for recording. I can still manually now play channel 2 individually, separately from the X recording. In fact, I could go right ahead and change channel 2 to be, say, an LFO. And now channel 1 is still playing back my recording, and I now have channel 2 in LFO mode. So that's a really good example, and if I want to clear them, I just press Shift Clear, and that clears channel 2, Shift Clear, that clears channel 1. And as you can see there on the oscilloscope, they're back to their stable values. Okay, now let's explore a slightly different way we could use STONK. For example, we can generate envelopes, as I already showed, out of one of the channels. So let's select channel 2 here and set it into looping envelope mode. And that's channel 2, and it'll only work when we hit a clock into it there. So now we got envelopes coming out. Lovely. And now what I'm going to do is I want to send those envelopes, for example, into the VCA here in QPass. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed in some noise, white noise, here from the noise generator in KXA into QPass, and we're going to use that to generate hi-hats. So let's take a listen, and we'll patch the high-pass output here into this channel. And we'll just turn down warp. Now you hear that? I've got a hi-hat generator. I'll have to boost up the level a little bit there. Which I can play using the joystick. And say I decided I didn't want to modulate warp, and we're going to modulate the cutoff frequency. We're making the envelopes shorter. So you see, this is for more than just simply generating XY values or LFOs. By generating envelopes, we can also use it to open and close VCAs. And this time we're going to do some audio processing. So let's unpatch the output here of warp from directly going into the mixer. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to patch it into these two inputs here on STONK. Now, these are the audio processing inputs, and STONK has a couple of different audio processing algorithms in it. It's got a multi-mode filter, which is set by this mode. It's got a reverb, which is really cool. It's got a wavefolder, and it's also got VCAs built into it. So I didn't even have to do an example of the previous patch here where I did, for example, using this as a VCA. So we'll explore that in a second. Now I choose the left input. I'm going to set it to multi-mode filter, and the manual shows these modes, and the right input, and set it to multi-mode filter as well. Now we'll just patch these outputs here. So to move the cable out of the way. There we go. Patch that there, and that there. Now let's take a listen to the effect it has. Now I've got a filter here. Cutoff frequency, resonance. So there's the first audio processing algorithm, which we can play around with on STONK. And you can change what this controls, by the way. It can't just be cutoff frequency, it could be other things. Let's now try out the reverb algorithm as well on channels 1 and 2. There's the reverb amount. We can also set the audio input mode to envelope. So, for example, I could take the existing audio here and pass it through an envelope, which isn't that interesting really because I've already got envelopes here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go in and I am going to turn on drone mode, which will actually make this be a permanently playing oscillator, and now these envelopes will make a difference. And remember, I still have these XY outputs here I could do something with. There's a lot of possibilities for playing around with the way you can map these, and it actually gives you quite a flexible module because in a small setup you can use this, for example, as a filter, as a reverb, or as a VCA for an existing oscillator that you might be using somewhere else if you didn't have a VCA, and you still have these 4 additional outputs here that you can map to other locations. Of course, we can combine STONK with, for example, other filters, so we'll do the same thing as we did before, but this time we're going to route it through QPass and Mimeophone using these inputs, say, to play around with the filter frequencies and cutoffs. And we can use this maybe to play around with the repeat rate. And this one here with the halo, which adds a reverb smear. Let's patch in some drums. By the way, this is squares and circles. Squares and circles is a TNT4 implementation, not compatible with your standard firmware. This is different firmware, but it has a TNT4 which can do audio, so I'm using it as a drum module. So we got some drum voices here, synthesized drums, not samples, which I'm using just to add a bit of rhythm. Let's clean up these patch cables so we can see what's going on. There are some fun patches, but we're not done yet because there are some more ways we can explore using the modulation capabilities on STONK. And I'm also going to show you how you can remap some of the default controls here to actually control different aspects of the LFOs, the envelopes, and indeed the audio processing filters as well. So I'm going to unpatch this to clean things up a little bit, and then we can get stuck in with some more examples. Okay, let's look at how we can do slightly more advanced patching. And what I want to do is show you how you're able to assign parameters to all of these different modes. And you'll notice this white text here under these buttons here, which we were using to change the mode for each of the channel. These are accessed by pressing this shift button, and these are what allow you to change the parameter mappings for each of the channels, 1, 2, and left and right. And that means you can control different parts of the algorithms assigned onto those channels. So remember, I had X and Y and LFO speed, for example, on these things. You could change, for example, the different parameters assigned to the joystick. So let's take a look at how to do that, because that allows you to have even more control over what's going on with the joystick. So once again, we're going to set up channel 1 here, and we'll set channel 1 to just be the XY value. You see it there on the scope as I move the joystick. Now, there's nothing particularly interesting about that. So what I'm going to do is change channel 1 to be LFO by pressing LFO. And now I've got a free running LFO here, which I can adjust the speed of, for example. By default in LFO mode, for example, the X channel input represents the frequency and the Y channel is the wave shape, but we could change this around. Let's change what the Y channel controls. So, for example, if we wanted to change it, say, to control the amplitude of the LFO, that could be interesting. So let's do that. So how do we change the default parameter mapping? So I'm on channel 1, I have it selected, we have it in LFO mode, and what I do is I press Shift and a source to select the source. So I'm going to press Shift and vertical bar. Now, right now, vertical bar is used to represent the Y parameter when it comes to this LFO. And you'll see this LED here glowing, and that's because it's mapping the Y parameter, the up and down movement of the joystick, to the slope of the LFO, as you remember if I do this. So let's instead change it to be amplitude and turn off slope. Now when I do this, you see, I can control the amplitude of the LFO by using the Y movement, whereas the X movement is still mapped to the frequency of the LFO. Let's say I wanted to change the Y direction here to change the LFO offset instead of the amplitude. Now, if we look on the oscilloscope, we still have an LFO, but I can offset it up and down the voltage range by moving the joystick. Now, this brings me to the inputs up here, which we haven't actually explored yet. And these two inputs allow you to send CV modulation into this and choose them as a source. And this time I'm going to select CV input 1 by pressing Shift and 1, and I'm going to map it onto the offset. So now if I put a voltage in to CV input 1, and I'll use the voltage generator here in my case, watch on the oscilloscope screen, I can move the LFO wave shape up and down the voltage range. I can use the vertical to control the amplitude, and of course the X is still controlling the frequency. So that shows you how to remap these controls. Let's now look at channel 2, and we just press Shift to leave that mode. Now let's look at channel 2. Now right now channel 2 is just mapped into the, I'll just map it there, into the up and down movement. It's just the vertical. And instead I'm going to send it to be the envelope generator. So this is the Euclidean envelope generator. Let's just turn off the drums there, we don't need them. So as you can see on the oscilloscope screen, the yellow trace there are the Euclidean envelopes, and I can make them more frequent. I can adjust the wave shape. But again, let's say I wanted to control the amplitude of those envelopes. How would I do that? So I'm on channel 2, it's selected, we know it's on envelope mode. So again, I'm going to press Shift and 2 to select CV input 2. And again, I am going to choose amp as the parameter that I want to control, which is the amplitude. So now CV input 2 controls the envelope amplitude. And let's, for example, do the same thing as before. We'll send in a voltage, and now I can control the amplitude of the envelopes. Okay, what I've done this time is I've patched the output of my oscillator warp here into the audio input channels, and we're going to play around with some of the parameters that can be assigned to the audio processing side of STONK. And I've just patched the output here into Mimeophone, and right now I have the left and right inputs here, which I'm treating as a stereo pair. Of course, they could be two independent audio channels, but I have them both in the first mode, which for the audio channels is the filter. Let's take a listen. X is the cutoff frequency. Y is our resonance, just like I showed you before. Now let's remap the Y to be the low or high pass mix, because this is a multi-mode filter, so it can either be in low pass mode or high pass mode. So I don't want to play around with resonance, I just want to change whether it's a low pass filter or a high pass filter. Great friend of chain DJing effects. So how do we do that? What we do is we again select the input we want to change, which is left input first. We do Shift and Y, and we see that it's mapped onto this third parameter, which corresponds to resonance. And instead, I'm going to set it to this last parameter here and turn off the middle one, because that will correspond to the low high pass mix. And I do the same thing with my right channel, select Shift again, turn off resonance, and change it to low pass, high pass mix. Press Shift to turn it off. Now let's see what happens. Now this is my cutoff frequency. Now I'm in high pass filter mode. Now I'm in a low pass filter mode. Do you hear the difference? Low pass, high pass. So that shows you how you can remap different parameters using the same principle as we did on the CV channel. You can remap audio channel parameters. And the manual shows you, as you can see here on the screen, quite a few different parameters that can be remapped. And they correspond to these buttons here. Okay, say I like what I've done in terms of all my setups here and I want to save them. Well, we actually have 6 preset slots because we can use these bottom buttons here as preset selectors. So if I wanted to save this as a preset, I'd press Shift and or, which corresponds as S for save. And I'm going to press slot number 1 here, the LEDs flash, and now I have saved this preset. Well, I hope this gave you a bit of an idea of how flexible STONK is as a modulation source for patches. I've actually been really surprised at all the different ways I've found to use it. Between the CV recording, the built-in envelopes, the Euclidean envelopes on the VCA built in on the audio channels too, it's actually a pretty flexible little module to be building patches around. It's only 16 HP, but you get a joystick, a recorder, reverb, multi-mode filter, CV recording, audio looping, and 4 modulation outputs, which can be LFOs or manually controlled. There's a lot going on in this module, and I actually find myself using it in quite a lot of patches. It's right down there on my bottom row where I have all my control surfaces. Anyway, feel free to leave me some questions down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from people and always do my best to try and answer. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with future videos. Thanks very much for watching.